To begin, I ask that you take out your worksheet that has all the definitions on them, and then as we go through the lecture, just make sure that you're writing down the formal definitions and kind of the main ideas as just a basis of geopolitics. So what does geography have to do with politics? In this lecture, what exactly are we going to learn? So we're going to learn the definitions of geopolitics, imperialism, colonialism, colonization, neocolonialism, hegemony, and we're going to dive a little bit into civilizations and look at a little bit of Huntington's theory about that. We're also going to look a little bit into regions and their relationship to politics, cultures, and the formalities of just how they're divided, just kind of give that basis. And then we're going to apply all of this to a modern day example that goes back way in history, way before our time, and we're going to apply geopolitics to a real life event. So to start out, what is geopolitics? The formal definition is that it's the state's power to control space or territory and shape the foreign policy of individual states and international political relations. So what does that mean, really? So geopolitics basically is we're going to leave both geography and the physical nature of the Earth with politics. Politics has a lot to do with geography. In the opening picture that you saw, that was the border of the United States and Mexico. And so what we see is that geography, that having those two nations right next to each other, of the United States and Mexico, can create political division. So we put up that border to make sure that the United States citizens stay in, the citizens of Mexico stay in their country, and there's a huge political strife because of this. So geography has just as much to do with politics as any other, the economy, the financial sector, all of those things have to buy into the politics, but geography does as well. So what are we going to see? We're going to see more of competition rather than collaboration. So that means that the states are going to be competing with one another rather than working together. So imperialism, colonialism, and colonization kind of all go together. We see this as one big nation state ruling over and having an extension of power to other nations. And they control these states through direct or indirect controls of their economy and political life. And so basically, a really good example of this is the British Empire in the 1920s. They were the biggest empire at this time, and they had a whole bunch of colonies where they were gaining resources. So they were gaining those resources in those different nations in order to sell, outward, so it could improve their economy, right? And so we see how the British Empire had not only a tie economically, but politically they would also send over appointees to kind of rule over these other nations. So that kind of brings us to colonialism and colonization, which is the physical settlement in new territory, people from a colonizing state. So this is the British people coming over to a new state. So the United States, for example, was colonized originally. They had colonies of British people that came over. Eventually, as we know, we fought for independence. And this is kind of what is a very common theme among colonies, is that they eventually fight for independence. We see this in South America as well with, Mexico, their fight for independence from Spain, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, all of these places eventually fought for their own independence so they could rule over themselves. So why did this change? Why is it that now we don't see as many colonies, or we don't hear about as many colonies? So this happened shortly after World War II. We saw a lot of decolonization. With the peace treaties and everything that was happening during World War II, we had some countries that were immensely powerful and had control over a vast amount of nation states. And so that kind of got broken up, and we see kind of the end of that sort of colonialism. Obviously not the very end, because it's pretty rare, but there's very few colonies left, but there's still some. And so neocolonialism, neo means new, and colonialism, as we know, is kind of that physical settlement. So we see this new shift in how people are colonizing states. So it's the economic and political strategies by which powerful states and core economies, i.e. the United States or Britain, indirectly maintain or extend their influence over other areas or people. Controls are exerted through such indirect strategies as international financial regulations, commercial relations, and covert intelligence operations. As you all know, or have learned in your history classes, is that Cuba was, we were kind of in this struggle and this fight for colonization there, in this more neo-colonialist idea, especially in the 1950s, 60s, more so the 60s, and we had these CIA operations that were going on there. So we see that in examples like Cuba. And also you see an example of this in the cartoon here that says, oh, now that we've destroyed your country, you can pay us to rebuild it. And we accept natural resources like oil as payment. And so that's kind of, we're going to get into more the oil struggle with the United States and the Middle East later in the lecture. So hegemony. Hegemony is just the domination of the world system, exercised through a combination of economic, military, financial, and cultural means by one national state in particular historical epoch. So what does that mean? Basically, it's the authority over others. So it's kind of a silly example, but the United States has definitely a hegemonic position on fast food restaurants. So as you see in the picture, McDonald's is literally everywhere. I think the only place it shows in the map that it's not is in North Korea. But we can see that McDonald's has made a shift from being just in the United States to extending its world power into all different nations. Even in India, where the cow is seen as a sacred animal, and so they don't eat beef. So they've changed their menu, as you can see right below the map, to accompany their cultural needs. So each it has dominance over other, even just culturally. So they're still involving that fast food restaurant, but in their own cultural way. So we can see that, as a silly example, the United States has that hegemonic dominant position in fast food restaurants. But where else can we see examples of hegemony? We can see it militarily, especially. The United States has bases all around the world to just kind of exert that power, that we are still a world power, and to keep the peace. That's what we have extended a lot of times. And so in the map on the left, you see the Central Asian ring. You can see all the little airplanes. The red airplanes are the United States military bases. So you can see that they're kind of just in all different areas. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, all the places that eventually we, have that dominant position over. But we've been in that struggle, right? We've had this kind of military strife over control in the Middle East. And on the right, you can see an example of, the soldiers that are in Afghanistan. So again, is geopolitics competition or is it collaboration? We can see that regions are divided up among common traits. So there's the north, or there's the south, the west, the midwest, and the northeast. And you can kind of divide those among those common traits. Does that mean that everyone always gets along? Absolutely not. Even we see in the 1860s in the United States, during the Civil War, the fight was basically among different ideals. So we had the North, the Union, and then the South Confederates. So that's kind of that. Even though we may be in those formal regions, we have the likeness of the other people in the North and the likeness of the people in the South. That doesn't mean that those always are going to get along. And so there's more of that competition rather than collaboration, that fighting between the states. So there's functional nodal region and vernacular region. The vernacular is more like the everyday ordinary, what people say makes that region. So northern Colorado, we're known to have breweries. Fort Collins, we have a lot of breweries. And so that's what, some people may say that's what makes the region. And then the functional nodal region is formed by a set of places and their functional integration. How do places interact and function together? So now we can put geopolitics to practice. So we understand that geography has to do with politics. We understand that there's an idea of this neo-colonialism, that we're trying to get this dominant hegemonic position on other nation states through the financial system and through natural resources. So we're going to look at natural resources and how they have their influence in the way that we interact with others, especially the United States and the Middle East. So where did it all start? It started all the way back in 1918. And we kind of broke into the Middle East, and we had this fight for the oil. And so we kind of, as it goes on, from 1920 to 1960, we see that our relationship with the Middle East changes as the competition for oil increases, or as our desire, our demand for oil increases. Our agreements, our relationship with the Middle East will kind of shift and will be a lot more of a competition based. Eventually, I mean, we get led to immense frustration and immense competition, which brings military strife. And so our United States military invades into the Middle East and is kind of trying to control that sort of power. So next we'll be watching what happens because of the U.S. high demand of oil and the Middle East high production of oil. This is still happening today, although we can see it back in history that there's been this kind of gentle ease, or not so gentle, because there's been a lot of tremendous hurt over this fight for the resource of oil. But it still continues to happen today. And so the example here is in Saudi Arabia. And this was a relatively recent example. And so to look at it, watch the video, and then do a brief description of what it said and a summary of what that tells you about geopolitics.